There's a difference between hiring a remote employee and working in another country. And by the way, even if you hire that remote employee, there are things that you should be considering before you start paying them if you don't want to mess later on. Welcome back to Revenue Remix. I'm Summer Paletti, your host, founder and CRO of Rise of Us, where I help growth stage companies get to their next level. And joining me today are some friends from the cold north. Uh, we're doing a special episode on working with US and Canada. We share a long border, we share language, we share a culture. And so we're going to talk a little bit about working cross border. Be you in Canada and you're going to work in the US, be you in the US and you're going to work in Canada. It's often somebody's first entrance into working globally. Joining me today are two panelists, both of whom I met through Bordy. So, Eric, why don't you introduce yourself real quick?
Sure. I'm Eric Hachmer, and it's really pleased to be here with you today. I run a consulting firm that specializes in go-to-market strategy and sales effectiveness. And really what that means is I help fast-growing B2B firms scale and professionalize their sales function. That's really what I do, and that's based on too many years in corporate life, and now I do this with fast-growing companies, and love having these conversations.
Nice. And you're located in Toronto, right?
Awesome.
I am. I'm based in Toronto. I've lived and worked in a variety of countries, and in my most recent role, before I started my own practice, I ran a consulting practice for EY that focused on the Americas, and I spent 95% of my time working with U.S. teams and U.S. clients, and so this is near and dear to my heart.
Nice. Thank you. Okay, Komal, why don't you introduce yourself real quick?
Yeah, for sure. So my name is Komal, also based in Toronto, live close to High Park, which is beautiful if you ever want to visit from that side of the border. I'm currently the CEO at Owner. Owner is owned by RBCX, which is also owned by RBC, which is a bank. So we are a tech banking practice. Really, really fun stuff that we're doing in terms of incorporating new businesses and really helping entrepreneurs start their business compliantly with all the correct tax structures in place. I've been in the tech space for over 13 years and been through 2 acquisitions. Definitely been fun taking teams through a lot of the nuance around go-to-market, talent strategy, and ops in general. So I'm excited to be on the podcast and contribute my views.
Yay, thank you. All right. Well, we're going to start with the boring stuff first, and then we're going to talk a little bit about culture and people stuff and getting along. So, as I was trying to recruit a third panelist, I got a comment that I feel like we should bring to this because it was smart. He was like, why are you talking about this? There are payroll platforms now that work globally that make it really easy to add an employee in another country. And I thought, this is perfect. Yes, that is absolutely accurate. It is way easier to add employees in other countries than it used to be. And that's great. From where I stand, having worked in tax tech in the US and Canada for a large portion of my career, there's a difference between hiring a remote employee and working in another country. And by the way, even if you hire that remote employee, there are things that you should be considering before you start paying them if you don't want to mess later on. So why don't we start there? Eric, I'm going to start with you. From the Canadian side, like, what do people need to know when they think like, ooh, I want to, my employee moved to Toronto, or I found great talent in Toronto. I'm gonna start employing people in Canada. Like, I know it's not that simple. What should they be thinking about other than just adding them to payroll?
Well, I think it's a great question. How long you got? I mean, it's about, what's their purpose in the organization? How do you equip them for success and provide them the tools they need? I think hiring is the easy part, right? But, when I think about it from a go-to-market and a sales perspective, it's easy to hire some salespeople. But, giving them the right direction, enabling them for success, providing them with the coaching and leadership, that's the hard stuff that happens every day. So, hiring your employees is like finding your office and you're open for business. That's terrific. But then the real magic starts, and that's with the actual people in chair, growing the business, right? So I think we need to focus more on the model we're trying to create versus just getting the people on the payroll.
I like that. I did not expect that answer, but I like that. I'm talking a lot about that these days. Okay, so Kamal, from a tax compliance perspective, what should someone, let's pretend they did what Eric said and we have the structure first and now we're going to do the hire. Is there anything from the tax perspective that we should be considering to do business correctly across border?
Yeah, I'd say first, and this is predicated on where I am currently working, is make sure that you're incorporated properly in Canada and that the corp set up correctly to actually deduce these taxes for your employees as well. You could be registered as a sole proprietorship or an incorporation. I would say do it as an incorporation because a sole prop is essentially a one-person business. And it's more personal than it being a professional type of business. So incorporate correctly. And then when you're hiring your employees, make sure that you understand that the tax structures are very different in terms of being province led, and it's also very centralized because everything bubbles up to being federal as well. So that's one piece. The other thing that I'd say is taxes are higher or can potentially be higher in Canada as opposed to the US. So make sure that your salary bands kind of reflect where you're hiring for, kind of like a good living wages, what type of role you're hiring for as well. Like as an example, devs are a lot more expensive as compared to maybe BDR and SDR that you'd like to hire on a team. So those implications are very important. I really like what Eric said in terms of like the purpose of the business. So are you just growing a tech shop here? Is it like a sales shop? And how does it kind of take your business forward? Do you really truly want to be cross-functional in terms of the border, i.e. you're seeing business collaboration between both those countries and kind of bringing maybe technological pursuits together, or is it something else that you want to achieve? Do you want to do an acquisition? Are you looking for Canadian investors? There's so much that goes into kind of setting up shop here. So I'd say in a nutshell, make sure that you incorporate correctly, you understand tax structures for employees, and you're looking at the living wage, and then you'd probably get the best talent you have out there here in Canada.
Yes. Yes. I love that you brought the wage in. Having a proper comp strategy is really important. Good. Thank you. And then I'm just going to add, like from the US side, I often see people a little shocked when they start to do business in the US. Since I worked in HCM for so long, there's a lot of money in payroll here, and it's very enticing, be you from India or Europe or from Canada. And our tax structure is a hot mess. It is so complicated from incorporating properly. Yes, get the bank account here. You can't just use your foreign bank account. And just keep in mind that if you get an address wrong, like you could have one tax here and one tax across the street. And sometimes somebody pays one or the other, sometimes they pay both. So you have to be really careful. The one thing that those do-it-yourself payroll systems do is they let you control and they let you add an employee. They also let you make boo-boos, expensive boo-boos. And by the way, they leave you holding the bag if there's a penalty for that. So you just have to be extremely careful, and it would probably be a good idea to get an expert in on the compliance side. But I really like that both of you took it to what's the purpose? Like, what is the objective? Because sometimes it can be chasing a shiny object, but there's a lot there that you should consider that if you don't have a clear business objective, like maybe let's not bother. Okay, good stuff. Is there anything else you guys want to talk about that's boring before we kind of get a little bit more fun and talk about people and culture?
In terms of like the comp strategy, the other piece I think that is really important is benefits, and really understanding that benefits and equity are a part of standard comp structures across most organizations in Canada. So that's something you may want to consider, given healthcare is also free in Canada versus the US. So how that kind of trickles down into how you want to structure your benefits as a new employer.
Yeah, let me
is
add to that
important.
because it's a great example, Kamal, of needing to understand the differences, right? And I think a key theme I'll probably touch on a couple of times is you can't do this off the side of your desk. If you're going to commit to going into the other market, whether US into Canada or vice versa, you got to go all in, right? And I mean, what I mean by that is commit to it. So for example, benefits. Someone might think, oh, it's dental and medical, and look, people have teeth above and below the border, and we'll get you the same. And it's not the same. Like there's subtleties, and I'll give you two examples. One of them is maternity leave, right? If you're going to do a benefit, you've got to understand that people get 12 plus months of maternity leave in Canada, and they get 12 weeks in the US. And you have to think about that. That's a striking difference in terms of what people's expectations are. Another example is how we treat stock options. If you're going to motivate people, they're taxable in the US. They're not taxable from a capital gains perspective in Canada. Like the impact of that incentive is going to differ dramatically above or below the border. So you might think that, oh, this incentive plan works really good for my employees in country A. It's not going to have the same impact in country B necessarily. So you've got to lean in and commit to understanding those subtleties, right? Because there are a lot of them. Now, thankfully, they're not all fatal if you get them wrong, for lack of a better word, right? But they can create you a lot of heartburn and a lot of things you'd have to unwind if you get too far along and you haven't got it right.
Yeah. No, that's perfect ad and also perfect segue. So I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the things that aren't easily found when you're researching compliance or how do I set up an org in this country or whatever. Those are easily found. I'll go first and then I'll let you folks talk. From the American side of the fence, what I see is it's a big country. There's a lot of people because of Hollywood, uh, social media platforms here. I think that Americans tend to take for granted that like the way we talk and the way we do things is just how things are done. And that's not accurate. I also think that the shared border, the shared language, and a lot of aspects of shared culture contribute to that, especially when we're working with Canada. I don't see as much things being taken for granted when I see people working in Latin America, especially Mexico. But there's a lot of things that us Americans, us boorish Americans, take for granted. And right now we're recording this in February of 2026, and we're not going to talk about politics. However, we can't talk about culture without talking about the fact that the American political scene right now has caused friction between us and our neighbor to the north. So we're not going to talk about that, but I think it's a good example of us being a little pushy as a culture sometimes. So what I'd like to do is talk a little bit, let's focus more on, I think it's probably easier for Canadians to come into the US and understand the culture because it's so loud. And it's probably less easy for Americans to come into Canada and understand the nuances in the culture because of those things that we take for granted. So, Kamal, why don't you go first and just tell us some things culturally that Americans would be good to understand and be mindful of?
No, 100%. I think overall, we Canadians are very polite. Everyone knows this, and we're a very friendly bunch. I'm a big Harry Potter fan as well. So help will be given at Hogwarts when you're asked, when you ask for it. So essentially, it's the same thing within Canada. Everyone wants to help. Everyone's very supportive. When you do ask for good advice, you're given it. So given that, I also feel like people are very intentional with the way that they operate. So, as an example, we're rolling out certain strategies within the organization, and we're being very intentional about them because we want to make sure that we care for our customers and all of our stakeholders that are involved. And this kind of cascades down into personal lives as well. Whether you have a partner, you have children, you have work colleagues, everyone's intentional with their relationships and the way that you kind of interface with people on an everyday basis. Having lived in the US, I feel like to your point, people can be more direct and they can be a little more forthcoming in terms of their views and the way that they speak, and which is fine. But I feel like if you're living and working in Canada, kind of really trying to assess the mood and the gap in the room would be great before you actually put out your intentions or your advice. The second is people are really great listeners. So if you do have something to say, people will listen, but don't expect them to take your advice all the time. So those are just the two caveats that I've seen at the workplace. And I think structurally as well, Canada has very, very unique points of view because we have so much of a melting pot with cultures within neighborhoods as well. You have Greek Town, you have great Indian food, you have great Chinese food, you have all types of folks coming in and living here. So I feel like that really diversifies the way that we view culture as a whole and the way that we interact with each other as well.
Yes. Okay, now you're talking my language. Food.
Yeah, well said, Kamal. I would agree. I mean, a couple of things I would throw in there. I mean, let's not lose sight of the fact that Canada is a much smaller country, and not just compared to the US, but compared to others. So we naturally have to pay more attention and think about the other countries, and especially when it comes to the US. You know what? Canada's a rounding error for many multinationals based out of the US. It's often 10% of what the business is and the revenue is in the US. So if they get it wrong, it's not a huge deal. Well, US is 10 times as big as Canada, right? So, I think we have to spend a lot more time understanding, being empathetic, being open and paying attention. So I think that's a little bit of a difference. The other thing I would throw out there is there's an element of how we treat and manage trust, I think, is different in both cultures, and especially from a business standpoint. And one time, and as an expat, people explained, and it was a good analogy. They said Americans, not to generalize, are a little bit like a peach, really soft and juicy on the outside, and it's easy to kind of get in, but then there's a core in the middle that's it's going to be really tough to break through. Whereas a Canadian or maybe a European might be more like a coconut, like it's hard shell, but once you get through, it's lovely inside. And I think that a little bit is how the trust in business in Canada, it's a little more important to establish trust, and then you get to the facts and figures, whereas in the US things are a little bit more direct. Credibility is based, in my experience, more on data than on personal trust. You earn trust over time, but the business conversation is more based on the data and the discussion, and that's where credibility is established. In Canada, if you just came into Canada and started throwing numbers at it, people would go, oh, no, 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 hold on, just slow down. I don't know if I trust you yet. So first we're going to build that part of it, and then we'll get into the facts and figures. So it's those little subtleties that I think you have to understand. But it's always a range, right? Like a spectrum. There's on both ends. There's some ultra conservative Canadians and there's some ultra collaborative Americans, and vice versa. So not people are on the different range, but I think in general we build and establish and maintain trust in slightly different ways, and that impacts how we do business.
Yeah, for sure. I'm glad you brought that up. And through those conversations, I'm thinking about, because America's so big and our population is all over the place, whereas in Canada, in Yukon Territory, there's not large cities, right? It's a wee bit too cold. Regionally, within the US, there are very different ways of communication, and what you describe with the facts and the data, that is very New York, that is very Boston. And what you described with, like, let's talk about football first. I mean, in Canada it'd probably be hockey. Let's talk about
Yeah.
sports first. Let's have a half-hour conversation. I'll decide if I like you, then maybe we could talk about business.
Yep.
That's the South, and to some degree the Midwest as
Yep.
well. So it's funny, you're kind of describing how I have to train new reps within the United States. If it's a nationwide, channel partner, okay, when you're dealing with this region and this region and this region, you're constantly having to code switch. So it's a good idea, I think, in general, to know the the way that people prefer to do business in the area that you're entering.
Yep. The other thing I would too add as a summary it's I was going to say is it risk aversity and ability to embrace or avoid risk is so different, right? And I think many of the folks that'll listen to this podcast will remember the financial meltdown in 2009, if you remember. And a great quote came out of that, because if you remember, some of the US banks were in deep trouble. Balance sheets were highly leveraged, and the Canadian banks, the big five, they just kept rolling along. And someone asked, like, why? What's the difference? I mean, it's just we're right across the lake from each other. And the quote I loved was, you know what? Americans love to make money, and Canadians love to count it. And it just kind of captured a little bit of the difference in risk tolerance. And I raise that just because it impacts so many things of doing business. When you manage a sales organization in the US versus Canada, there's an expectation of higher performance, of taking more risk, of pushing harder on clients. There's versus in the way you would manage performance for a Canadian sales team. Not that we don't want the same level of performance, but you're going to have to go about it in a different way, because people aren't going to respond to the same motivators, carrot or stick. It's going to be different above and below the border, right? So I think some of those subtleties play out on a daily basis in terms of how people operate and how leadership teams need to support their people.
Yeah, I mean, risk also comes in many different forms. So if you're a tech company, as an example, one of the biggest things that you would want as an American business is to actually have servers in Canada. Very, very key if you want to grow technology here, because everyone, to Eric's point, is risk averse and wants to own the data locally as well. So when you start to look at just not just like people risk, but operational risks and risks in terms of like technology, where your servers are, data, who owns the data, yada, 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 then you're kind of getting into very different territory.
Yeah. Okay. That's helpful to know. I mean, anything in business is risk. So to understand that there's different tolerances for risk, that's huge. So I spent a little bit of time in the payment space. So I want to talk a little bit about cross-border payments because that's another area where I see the technology making it a little bit easier. Um, do you guys have some pointers or some thoughts on that? Kamal, I'll start with you since you're in the banking space.
Yeah, no, for sure. I think our banks are being more open for sure in terms of how you do cross-border payments, and especially RBC is at the forefront of that
Mm,
innovation. I think people movement and money movement are simultaneous. And so if you figure out a way to make sure that everything is compliantly built to do both, then I feel like you'd have a winning structure in terms of the way that you formulated your business from the ground up. We also have a range of fintech companies that are coming up, owner being at the forefront of it. So when you're really looking at money movement, I'd say the AML and the risk pieces, going back to Eric's point, are very key. But I'd also look at factors such as why you want to move the money, or is there greater capabilities to keep the money in a specific country to grow those operations, and why you're actually doing those cross-border payments, I think is one of the big pieces of compliance that I come across on an everyday basis, especially for our clients. So we're trying to make sure that businesses as a whole, whether they're SMBs or slightly larger companies, that they have the leeway to be able to transact money. But we also want to understand the why behind it and then make that easier for them in terms of not having additional charges and making their business lines of credit and those types of things a lot more smoother.
yeah. I like that it's getting easier because when it gets easier, it gets cheaper. Nice. And faster.
100%.
Right, Eric,
Yes.
from your lens, do you have anything to add there?
Yeah, I think unfortunately this is an area of untapped potential because
Mm,
there's so much disruption from a technology perspective in a healthy way. But it drives me crazy. Let me give you a real example. I got lots of friends and I have family. My son lives in New York now. I can't use Venmo because I'm Canadian. I don't have a US bank account, right? It makes no sense, right? But
yeah.
that's a function of the different markets. Again, the Canadian banking system is more monopoly, more risk adverse, and more highly regulated. And that stifles the innovation that we need to make things easier, to make this border issue less, more transparent, that money can flow more easily across the border, that shared technologies. Why can't I use Venmo? Like, just because, why can't I have a bank account in Canada? Like, I use a Wise card and I can transfer money between currencies. I can send it to my son. I can do that, but I can't do other things. And it just makes no sense. So the technology is there and the willingness is there. I think, unfortunately, there's just we need to right size the level of regulation, especially on the Canadian side, to be a bit more innovative. And we may touch on this later in the call, but I think that's also a reason for net outflow of talent at times because things are happening quickly, more innovative and faster in the US. Not because the people are brighter, no disrespect to my American friends, but I think we just stifle innovation a little bit up here in Canada due to the higher regulation and lower appetite for risk.
Yeah, I do see that. I work with some folks in the EU. You all probably do as well. And it's similar there where it's such a fine line. And obviously the Americans do not have it right. There are things that are messy. But then if you regulate too much, then you're behind on certain innovations. Like where is that sweet spot? I don't know that anybody has really figured it out because you're either moving fast and breaking things and then looking back and going, oops, or you're holding back too much and then, your neighbors run circles around you. One of the things I was working on when I was in the payment space was cross border payments. because I live in California, Southern California to be specific, I could get to Mexico in 2 hours. As long as there's not a lot of traffic, okay? And so there's a lot of money that moves in between California and Mexico, and it is so hard and it is so expensive. And so I wanted to make that easier. However, the map had us going into Canada first because it was actually easier. In Latin America, especially around Mexico City, there has been just a fintech boom in the last few years. Like there's some really exciting stuff going on there. And I wonder if LATAM fintech is going to be what brings some of these innovations that we need. Of course, the regulations in each country will have to follow, but they're working on some cool technology down there. We'll see where it goes.
Yeah, no, I would totally agree. I think we don't. I mean, so much comes out of the U.S., for example, so much innovation and thought leadership. And I mean, even just look at the iPhone or whatever. I mean, there's so much great stuff. But yeah, we if we're not careful, we'll forget and miss these other hotbeds of innovation that are throughout Latin America. I mean, in my last role when I managed, teams across Latin America, very smart people, very credentialed, very innovative. And you mentioned Mexico City. You're right. There's a ton of really interesting things going on there that rival what we're doing in North America for sure. But you don't always hear about it because it doesn't get the same level of attention, and it's not as well connected to, you know, the US tech scene and US stock market, right?
Yeah, for sure. Hey, I don't live in Silicon Valley, so I am fully aware that there is cool stuff happening outside of Silicon Valley, right? And I'm here for it. More centers of innovation, because it's not lost on me that some of the innovations that are coming out of the US are immigrants. And they came here with their idea. So then I'm getting very kumbaya, very futuristic here, but like, is there something in the near future where we see those people staying in their country of origin and innovating there because we're all working so much better cross borderly, if that's a word? And it's easier because I do see investors that are working more outside of Silicon Valley and supporting innovations in other areas. And where the money flows, the talent is attracted to that. Success is sometimes a big barrier to growth or success, because if you're not located where the funding is and the talent is, and for whatever reason you can't move, then you might have a great idea and nobody ever hears about it, which I feel like is just a little bit of a tragedy.
Yeah, I think part of it too is it's a great question, a great point. I think it's where the problems are, not where the tech talent is, right? And I'll
Yes.
give you an example. I'm part of some incubators and accelerator group communities here in Toronto around tech scene, and this one young lady was talking about technology to clean the water to make it drinkable, right? They weren't solving for that in Toronto because they didn't like the taste of tap water. They were solving for that in countries, third world countries, that it was a necessity for survival, right? And so I think part of it is where are the problems that are being solved, and then the question is where's the technology, the people. So I think we've solved some pretty spectacular problems in North America over the last decade from a tech standpoint, but it's not all the problems in the world to solve. And that's where the innovation that's happening in places that we don't even think about because we're not suffering from the same issues, right? But you're right, there is some really cool stuff going on that we will hear about when we share, that problem equally, right?
Yeah, sure. There's so many things that we take for granted.
I'm looking forward to open banking. That should be hitting Canada in 2026. So all of the cool stuff that you'd be able to do with open access APIs, and just the benefits of it from being easier loan applications and increased competition amongst financial providers to actually get the correct customers that they actually need. I believe very, very clearly in ICPs. So there's groups that actually need to be with a certain financial institution or a certain fintech, yada, yada, yada. So you should be able to kind of piecemeal that together and bring the correct customers to your door and then get them to stay. So I feel like open banking would do that a ton for our people. And then also very cognizant of the way that we'd also be processing all of this data and the purposes of improving control. So very in for that money movement that we were talking about. And that sweet spot, I think, is really recognizing the talent that we need to be able to facilitate open banking. Number one. Number two is what core compliance and controls we need. And then I think the third thing is how we're actually facilitating that customer experience. And I feel like once we have those three things in place, the talent will come, the money will come, just the intention needs to be clear. So looking forward to that for 2026.
The only thing I would say is we started the conversation with doing business cross-border. I am excited about the prospect, given all the stuff I know that's being talked about. And, I'm still very excited about the economic prospects for North America. And the only thing I would say is now is not the time to be shy for a Canadian business. Look to external markets, look to the US, look to Europe, but if you're going to do it, commit, right? It's not a side project. It's not taking what you've got and then just, you know, giving it a quick coat of paint and hoping it resonates in the market in the US. You've got to localize, understand it. Think about the structural things we talked about, tax and payments and things like that, but really get into the weeds on who the customer is, why they're different, how you need to support and service them, and then build the teams around that. But I think you can commit. If you can commit, even in a small way, then you can have success that you can build on. And I think we've got some exciting times ahead.
Structure and strategy first, always. Thank you.
Yeah, for sure. When you're starting off a business or you just want to start an arm in Canada, trust your gut, make correct decisions over easy ones. Always my mantra. The harder you work and the more pain you have, the better it'll be down the line. So do all the correct pieces. The second thing is when you're opening up an arm anywhere, or you're considering employees or you're considering culture or anything else of the sort, I think the number one thing is to be generous as leaders. I think it permeates into the way that you shape culture on an everyday basis. If you're generous with yourself, with the people around you, then you basically formulate innovation in very, very different ways. You're able to give talent the space that they need to grow your products in a very specific fashion. And I am a big believer of the fact that your culture permeates into the way that people view your products as well, or how you're building products on an everyday basis. Do that well. And if you kind of have your decision making down to a T, you're generous with your employees and with yourself, and you're basically able to formulate all your compliance and risk pieces together, you should be able to have a winning business. Obviously, the strategy pieces are very important that Eric mentioned. So once you throw those in there, I think you'd be super successful either side of the border.
Yeah, for sure. And I'm going to leave it with things are a little messy right now. However, in every messy situation, I see business leaders meet the moment before governmental leaders, always. Business leaders lead the way. And if you turn on your news app, if you're in the US, it's a little messy right now. If you turn on LinkedIn, there's just smart people doing smart things. And I think that focus is often helpful. And there's no reason why we can't do good things, even when things are a little bit messy. I always call on business leaders. Business leaders can fix this. Well, appreciate you folks spending some time. I learned things. I got some insights. This was helpful. Thank you. And for those of you listening in the car or the gym, I'm going to put these two folks in my show notes. You should follow them. And I appreciate the listen as well. Head over to my website or the YouTube channel and subscribe so you don't miss any other episodes. And I will see you folks next week.
Awesome.
Thanks, Summer.